In 1940, the United States Navy ordered 6 warships larger than any cruiser on Earth. 9 12-inch guns, 33 knots, armor built to survive shells no cruiser had ever carried. They were built to hunt and kill one specific enemy. That enemy never existed. The ships were called Alaska class. They would become some of the most powerful warships ever built by any navy. Faster than a battleship, harder hitting than any cruiser afloat. And almost the moment they were finished, they would become obsolete. Not because the engineering failed, because the war they were built for had already ended before they ever fired a shot at the thing they were designed to kill. 6 were ordered. Only 2 would ever see the ocean. One would sit 84% complete before the Navy simply stopped building it. How does a superpower's Navy spend a fortune building a ship to destroy a rival that was never actually there? The answer starts with a rumor, a design file in Tokyo that never left the drafting table, and a piece of American intelligence that was almost entirely wrong. Its name was USS Alaska. By the early 1930s, Germany had already changed the rules of naval warfare without firing a shot. The Deutschland-class ships the British nicknamed pocket battleships were smaller than a battleship, faster than a battleship, and armed heavier than any cruiser had a right to be. Every major navy on Earth looked at those ships and understood the same uncomfortable truth. The old categories no longer worked. A ship didn't have to be a battleship to hunt like one. The United States Navy took notice, but for years that was all it did. Planners sketched. Naval architects drafted concept after concept. Nothing moved past the drawing board. There was no immediate threat forcing anyone's hand, and in peacetime, ideas without urgency tend to die quietly in a filing cabinet. For most of the decade, that's exactly where this one sat. What the Navy was reaching for wasn't a bigger cruiser. It was something that didn't have a name yet. Cruisers were fast but couldn't survive a real gunfight with anything heavier than themselves. Battleships could survive almost anything, but they were slow, expensive, and tied down by treaty limits that capped how many a nation could build. The Navy wanted a ship that lived in the gap between those two worlds, something that could outrun a battleship and outgun a cruiser. On paper, it sounded like the perfect answer to a problem nobody had fully defined yet. That's the idea that would eventually become the Alaska class, a hybrid built on a single, simple principle: speed to catch anything it needed to fight, firepower to kill it once it did. Everything about the ship's design would trace back to that one philosophy, and understanding it is the key to understanding everything that happened to these ships later, because the same principle that made them formidable is exactly what would leave them without a mission. The concept had a name inside the Navy long before it had a class designation. They called it a cruiser killer, not a battleship replacement, not a fleet escort by original design, but a purpose-built hunter meant to track down and destroy the one kind of ship that could threaten American cruisers and get away before a battleship ever arrived to stop it. It was a narrow, specific role, a specialist's weapon, built around a specialist's job. For most of the 1930s, that role remained theoretical. No enemy ship existed that clearly justified building it. Without a defined threat, the Navy had no way to size the design. No way to know how big the guns needed to be or how fast the ship needed to move to catch its target. A weapon built to hunt something can't be designed until someone can describe what it's hunting. That description was coming. It just wasn't going to come from solid intelligence. It was going to come from a rumor about to reach Washington from the other side of the Pacific, and that rumor would do more to shape the Alaska class than any American engineer ever would. Do you want me to continue to Chapter 3? In 1937, that rumor arrived, and it changed everything. American naval intelligence began picking up fragments suggesting that Japan, which had already withdrawn from every naval treaty limiting warship construction, was designing a new class of super cruiser. A ship built specifically to outclass anything the U.S. Navy had in the water. The Japanese called the project Design B-65. Here is what made B-65 dangerous, even as a rumor. Japan had already proven it built ships nobody saw coming. The world had underestimated Japanese naval engineering before and gotten burned for it. So when word came that Tokyo might be building something bigger, faster, and more heavily armed than any American cruiser afloat, the Navy didn't have the luxury of waiting for confirmation. In naval planning, you don't wait until an enemy ship is finished to start building your answer. By then, it's too late. There was a problem, though, and it was one nobody inside the Navy could fully solve at the time. American intelligence on B-65 was thin, fragmented, and in places simply wrong. Nobody had blueprints. Nobody had confirmed tonnage, gun caliber, or top speed. What the Navy had was a collection of second-hand reports, aerial reconnaissance guesses, and worst-case assumptions filled in wherever the actual data ran out. In the absence of certainty, planners did what military planners always do. They assumed the enemy was building the most dangerous version of the ship they possibly could, and they designed to beat that version, not the real one. That assumption became policy. In 1938, the General Board of the Navy formally endorsed building a new class of large cruisers, and design work accelerated fast. Naval architects worked through a punishing set of trade-offs. Every ounce of armor added to protect the ship also slowed it down. Every knot of speed gained by cutting steel from the hull meant a thinner shield against enemy shells. Every inch added to the guns meant more weight the engines had to drag through open water. This wasn't a simple engineering problem with one clean answer. It was ratio work. Tension held between three competing demands. And the ship that came out of it would carry every one of those compromises for the rest of its service life. What emerged from that process was formally designated as the Alaska-class large cruiser, hull classification CB. Officially, the Navy called them cruisers. Unofficially, sailors, officers, and later historians would call them battlecruisers, because nothing about their size or firepower fit comfortably inside the word cruiser anymore. The numbers alone explained the confusion. Standard displacement came in at 29,779 long tons, rising past 34,000 tons fully loaded. A ship roughly the size of a small battleship. Overall length stretched to 808 feet, 6 inches, with a beam of 91 feet. Main battery consisted of 9 12-inch 50 caliber Mark 8 guns, mounted in 3 triple turrets. That caliber alone was a statement of intent. The U.S. Navy had not built a 12-inch naval gun in decades. This was a purpose-built weapon, engineered from scratch for one job. Punching through the kind of armor a rival supercruiser was assumed to carry. Powered by 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers driving 4 General Electric turbines, the Alaska class could reach 33 knots, fast enough to run down almost anything afloat that wasn't a destroyer, and fast enough to outrun any battleship in the world if the fight went the wrong way. Range came in at roughly 12,000 nautical miles at cruising speed, giving these ships the legs to operate across the vast distances of the Pacific without constant refueling. On paper, every requirement had been met. The ship could catch a cruiser. The ship could outgun a cruiser. The ship could survive long enough to close the distance and land the first heavy blow. Against the imagined B-65, it looked, on paper, unbeatable. There was one detail buried inside those specifications that nobody chose to dwell on in 1940, because it wasn't a flaw yet. It was simply a trade-off. One line item in a long list of engineering compromises. To hit 33 knots and still carry 12-inch guns, the armor belt had been limited to protection against 12-inch shells only, and the protection below the waterline, against torpedoes, against the kind of damage a submarine could inflict in the dark, was thin. At the time, that didn't register as a weakness. It registered as the price of speed, the same price every fast warship in history had paid in one form or another. In September 1940, the order was signed. 6 ships: Alaska, Guam, Hawaii, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Samoa. Steel was ordered. Shipyards began clearing space on their building ways. On paper, and only on paper, the United States Navy had just designed the ship that would settle the score with an enemy vessel that, as far as anyone could later confirm, never once had steel cut for it. The order to build had been won. What come next would decide whether it had been the right order to give. Steel began moving in early 1941. USS Alaska was laid down on December 17, 1941, just 10 days after Pearl Harbor, a coincidence of timing that meant a ship designed to hunt a rumored enemy was now being built in the shadow of a very real one. USS Guam followed at the same yard, New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey. Construction moved through the war years at a pace dictated by wartime priorities that had shifted dramatically since the order was first signed. Alaska launched on August 15, 1943. Guam followed on November 12 of that same year. Both were commissioned in 1944. Alaska on June 17th, Guam on September 17th, arriving in the fleet more than 3.5 years after the keel laying that started them, and nearly 7 years after the rumor that had justified building them in the first place. 7 years is a long time in a war. It's long enough for an entire strategic picture to change beyond recognition, and that is exactly what had happened while these ships were being built. When Alaska and Guam finally reached the Pacific in early 1945, the naval war they had been designed to fight no longer existed. The Imperial Japanese Navy's surface cruiser fleet, the very ships the Alaska class had been built to hunt down and destroy in a gun duel, had been devastated over the preceding 2 years by an entirely different kind of American weapon, naval aviation and submarine warfare. Carrier aircraft had sunk Japanese cruisers by the dozen. American submarines had picked off others in the open Pacific, unseen and unanswered. By the time these two 12-inch gunned hunters arrived on station, there was almost nothing left standing that matched the job description they'd been built for. So the Navy did what every military organization does. When a weapon arrives without its intended mission, it found the ship a new one. Alaska and Guam were folded into the fast carrier task forces, not as hunters, but as shields. Their job became anti-aircraft escort, using their speed to stay matched stride for stride with aircraft carriers that could outrun almost anything else in the fleet, and using their heavy secondary batteries to help fill the sky with flak against incoming Japanese aircraft. It was not the mission these ships were engineered around. It was, in practice, the only mission left for them to do. In February 1945, both ships took part in the assault on Iwo Jima, providing anti-aircraft screening for the carrier groups launching strikes over the island, conducting limited shore bombardment in support of the landings. From there, they moved into the brutal, prolonged campaign for Okinawa, running from February through July 1945. The longest and costliest naval battle of the Pacific War, defined above all else by the relentless threat of kamikaze attack. It was during this stretch that Alaska had its closest brush with the kind of weapon no naval architect in 1938 could have designed against. Japan had begun deploying the Oka, a rocket-powered, piloted suicide weapon, carried partway to its target by a bomber before being released to dive into an enemy ship at speeds no anti-aircraft gun crew had ever had to track before. Alaska's gun crews engaged and are credited with shooting down aircraft during these operations, including a possible Oka, a defensive kill against a weapon built for exactly one outcome, and Alaska's crews stopped it from reaching that outcome. Between March and July 1945, Alaska and Guam also conducted limited shore bombardment operations, adding their 12-inch guns to the barrage supporting the ground campaign, a role that made use of their firepower, even as it had nothing to do with the ship-versus-ship duel they'd been engineered for. In July and August 1945, both ships were reassigned to sweep operations in the East China and Yellow Seas, actively searching for Japanese naval shipping, for a class of ship purpose-built to hunt enemy cruisers. This should have been the moment of validation, the mission finally matching the machine. Instead, the sweeps found almost nothing. No Japanese cruisers to engage. No confrontation to settle the question these ships were designed to answer. The silence in those waters wasn't a failure of Alaska and Guam. It was the final proof of just how completely the naval war around them had already been decided by other weapons, arriving years before these ships ever could. When the war ended weeks later, Alaska carried 3 battle stars into the record books. Guam carried 2. Real honors, earned in real combat, for a ship that had spent the war doing almost everything except the one job it had been built to do. And that gap between what these ships were engineered to destroy and what they actually spent the war fighting instead would turn out to be the first visible crack in the entire cruiser-killer concept. It wouldn't be the last. Every warship carries its own contradiction built into the steel, and the Alaska class carried one that had been sitting quietly in its specifications since the day the design was finalized. To hit 33 knots while carrying 9 12-inch guns, engineers had made a calculated trade. The armor belt was built to stop a 12-inch shell, the exact caliber the ship itself carried, but protection below the waterline, against torpedoes, against mines, against anything a submarine or a lucky underwater hit could deliver, was thin. At the drafting table in 1938, that had registered as an acceptable price for speed. By 1945, in a Pacific crawling with submarines on both sides and increasingly sophisticated torpedo technology, it registered as something else entirely. A ship that could outpunch almost anything on the surface and could be killed by something it might never even see coming. This was the same problem that had haunted every fast, lightly armored warship since the beginning of the century. The same tension that had doomed actual battlecruisers in the First World War. Speed and firepower always came at armor's expense, and armor was the one thing standing between a crew and the bottom of the ocean when something finally got through. Alaska and Guam never took a torpedo hit in combat. They never had to find out the hard way just how thin that margin really was. But naval planners didn't need a sinking to understand the risk sitting in the design. They understood it the moment the blueprints were finalized. And they built the ships anyway, because by 1940, there had been no time left to redesign around a threat nobody could fully define. That technical vulnerability, though, was never the real flaw that killed the Alaska class. It was a real weakness, but it was a survivable one. The kind of trade-off every warship in history has carried in some form. The flaw that actually mattered wasn't written into the blueprints at all. It was written into the calendar. By the time Alaska and Guam reached the Pacific in early 1945, the war they had been designed to fight was already over, even though the larger war around them wasn't. The Imperial Japanese Navy's cruiser force, the specific class of enemy the Alaska class existed to hunt down and destroy in a gun duel, had been gutted years earlier by weapons nobody in 1938 had fully accounted for. Carrier-based dive bombers and torpedo planes had sent Japanese cruisers to the bottom by the dozen throughout 1943 and 1944. American submarines, operating largely unseen, had picked off still more in the open ocean, hunting silently in a campaign that never needed a single 12-inch gun to succeed. Naval warfare had moved on without waiting for the Alaska class to arrive and prove its purpose. This is the part of the story that cuts against the instinct to look for a villain, a single bad decision, a bureaucrat who sabotaged the program. There wasn't one. No one official mismanaged the project. No enemy engineer outdesigned the American team. The Alaska class wasn't defeated by a rival ship. It was defeated by time itself, by the simple, brutal fact that the naval war of 1945 was being decided in the sky and beneath the waves, not on the gun line between heavy cruisers. The entire premise the ship had been built around, a surface gun duel against an enemy supercruiser, had quietly stopped being how wars at sea were fought, and nobody had sent the shipyards a memo in time to stop construction before it was too late to matter. The rival that actually beat the Alaska class to the punch wasn't Design B-65. It never got the chance. It was carrier air power and submarine warfare, methods of naval combat that had matured faster than anyone building 12-inch gun turrets in 1938 could have predicted, and that shift left the Alaska class fighting a war that no longer existed by the time it showed up to fight it. The Navy noticed. Wartime planners are not sentimental about sunk costs, and by the mid-1940s, the evidence in front of them was impossible to ignore. 2 ships were now operational, performing a job, anti-aircraft escort, that had nothing to do with their original design intent. 4 more were still on order, in various stages of construction, built around a mission that current combat experience was actively proving obsolete in real time. Every dollar and every ton of steel going into finishing those remaining hulls was being spent on a concept the war itself had already quietly discredited. priorities shifted accordingly, and they shifted fast. Resources that might once have gone toward finishing the Alaska-class program began flowing instead toward the ships that actually were winning the Pacific War: fleet carriers, escort carriers, the destroyers and submarines that screened them. The Alaska-class wasn't canceled outright in 1945. Nothing that dramatic happened. It simply stopped being a priority. Quietly. The way most weapons programs actually die. Not with an order, but with an absence of orders. Hulls left sitting on the ways while attention and funding moved somewhere else. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the Alaska-class had become something almost unheard of in military history. A weapons program that had succeeded completely on its own engineering terms, and failed completely on the only terms that actually mattered. The ships could do everything they'd been designed to do. They could catch anything on the surface. They could outgun anything their size. And there was nothing left in the Pacific that needed catching or outgunning, because the entire category of naval warfare they'd been built to dominate had already been settled by other means before they ever arrived. That is the version of failure this class of ship represents, and it's a stranger, quieter kind of failure than a battle lost or a ship sunk. There would be no dramatic final stand for the Alaska-class, no last engagement where the flaw within finally caught up with the ship in a single decisive moment. What was coming instead was slower and, in its own way, harder to watch. A program winding down not in defeat but in irrelevance, as the ships that remained unfinished sat in their shipyards waiting for a decision the Navy had already effectively made without saying so out loud. By the time the guns went silent in August 1945, 4 ships in the Alaska-class program existed only as steel on the building ways, in various states of incompleteness, and their fates were about to be decided not by combat, but by paperwork. USS Hawaii, hull CB-3, was the furthest along. Laid down in December 1943, she had been under construction for years by the time the war ended, and by 1947 she stood at roughly 84% complete. 84% is not a rounding error. It is a ship with her hull essentially formed, her machinery largely installed, a vessel close enough to completion that finishing her would have been a matter of months, not years. She had turrets waiting to be mounted. She had a name, a number, a launch already behind her. What she didn't have anymore was a reason to exist. In 1947, the Navy made the call. Construction on Hawaii was suspended, not scrapped outright at first, but frozen in place, a nearly finished warship simply left to sit. There is a particular kind of quiet violence in that decision that a battle loss doesn't carry. No enemy fired the shot that stopped Hawaii. No storm damaged her hull. She was stopped by a memo, by budget officers and planning staff looking at post-war naval requirements, and concluding that finishing a 4th Alaska-class cruiser made no strategic sense in a Navy now built around carrier air power. The men who had spent years building her simply stopped showing up to keep building her. That is how most warships actually die in peacetime. Not in fire, but in slants, mid-sentence, with the welding torches set down and never picked back up. The other 3 hulls, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Samoa, never got even that far. All 3 were canceled before their construction advanced to anything resembling a recognizable warship, formally struck from the program in the immediate post-war contraction that swept through nearly every major shipbuilding effort the United States had underway. 6 ships had been ordered in September 1940, under the assumption that design B-65 represented a real and urgent threat. By 1947, 4 of those 6 existed only as canceled contracts, and a partially built hull nobody wanted to finish. Hawaii herself would linger for years afterward, not as a warship, but as a question the Navy kept almost answering and never did. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, she sat, incomplete, at various points considered for conversion, first as a possible command ship, later studied alongside her 2 completed sisters for conversion into a guided missile cruiser, as naval technology moved toward rockets instead of rifled guns. None of those studies ever turned into orders. Hawaii would eventually be sold for scrap without ever having been finished, without ever having put to sea under her own power. A hull that came within a few months of joining the fleet and instead spent her entire existence as roughly 4/5 of a warship, precisely finished enough to make the decision to abandon her feel like a waste, and precisely unfinished enough that nobody could justify seeing it through. That was the fate of the ships that never made it to war. The two that did, Alaska and Guam, were heading toward their own quieter ending, just a few years behind schedule. After the surrender in August 1945, both ships stayed on active, useful duty in the Pacific, just not the duty they'd been built for. They supported the occupation of Korea, part of the broader American naval presence establishing control across the region in the war's immediate aftermath. Alaska operated out of Tsingtao, China, before sailing for Jinsan, Korea, to begin the work of bringing American servicemen home. One of the thousands of ships across the Navy, quietly repurposed in 1945 and 1946 for the unglamorous, essential job of ending a war logistically, as well as militarily. Guam performed similar work. Her hull that had been engineered to hunt a rival battlecruiser now ferrying troops and equipment across the Pacific in the opposite direction, toward home instead of toward battle. There is something almost fitting in that final wartime role. Though nobody planning the Alaska class in 1938 could have predicted it, a ship designed around aggression, around hunting and destroying, spent its last operational months as an instrument of return, of demobilization, of a war finally, formally ending. It wasn't the mission the ship was built for. By 1946, almost nothing the Alaska class had done was the mission it was built for. That had become the pattern of this entire program, and this final chapter followed it precisely. Alaska was inactivated in August 1946, the formal first step toward taking a warship out of active service. Both Alaska and Guam were fully decommissioned on the same day, February 17, 1947. Roughly 2.5 years after Alaska had first been commissioned into the fleet in June 1944. 2.5 years. That is the entire operational lifespan of one of the most powerful cruiser designs the United States Navy had ever built. From first commissioning to the day her crew stood down and walked off the deck for the last time. Both ships were placed into what the Navy called the mothball fleet, part of the vast reserve of warships kept in preserved, inactive storage after the war. Ships too valuable to scrap immediately, but with no active role left to fill. They would sit there, silent, maintained just enough to prevent outright deterioration, for over a decade, waiting for a war or a mission that never came. 3 outcomes closed out this chapter of the Alaska-class story, and none of them involve a single engineer's personal downfall, because this was never a story built around one man's rise and fall. It was a program story, and the ending belonged to the program as a whole. The first outcome belonged to the ships themselves, Alaska and Guam. Fully built, fully capable, combat-tested and battle-star decorated, spent far more of their existence sitting in reserve than they ever spent at sea. 2 ships engineered for a war that no longer existed by the time they arrived, now waiting in mothballs for a war that would never come either. The second outcome belonged to the crews. The men who had trained on these ships, who had manned the anti-aircraft guns at Okinawa, and tracked incoming kamikaze runs off Iwo Jima, were reassigned across the fleet as their ships went into reserve. Their wartime service was real. Their battle stars earned in genuine combat. Even if the ships themselves never fought the war, they were designed to fight. For the sailors, decommissioning simply meant a transfer, a new posting, a Navy career that continued somewhere else, on some other hull. The third outcome belonged to the program itself, and this is the outcome that mattered most to naval history. An entire class of warship, 6 ships ordered, 6 budgets approved, years of shipyard labor and design work poured into a concept built around a threat that had been misread from the start, ended not with a decisive battle or a dramatic loss, but with paperwork, a decommissioning date, and a partially built hull sitting quietly in a shipyard waiting for someone to finally decide what to do with it. By 1947, the accounting was complete. 2 ships built, commissioned, fought a war they weren't designed for, and stood down within 3 years. 1 ship built almost to completion and abandoned there. 3 ships that never existed beyond a contract number and a name. 6 warships ordered to answer an enemy that intelligence had gotten almost entirely wrong. And by the time the last of them went silent, that enemy had never fired a single shot at any of them, because that enemy had never been built at all. For over a decade, Alaska and Guam sat in the reserve fleet, 2 of the most powerful gun cruisers ever built, doing nothing at all. Preserved, maintained, technically still part of the United States Navy, but functionally frozen in time, relics of a design philosophy. The Navy itself had already moved past before either ship fired a shot in anger. Then, in 1958, they got one more chance. Naval warfare by the late 1950s looked almost nothing like it had in 1945. Guided missiles were replacing naval rifles as the weapon of choice for surface combatants, and the Navy's Bureau of Ships began studying whether older hulls, ships with good speed, generous displacement, and structurally sound frames might be worth converting into a new generation of missile cruisers rather than scrapping outright. Alaska and Guam were exactly the kind of ships that study had in mind. Their 33-knot speed, once designed to run down an enemy cruiser, would have made them fast enough to escort the Navy's new supercarriers. Their size offered ample room for the systems this new era of naval combat required. The plan on the table was dramatic. Strip both ships down to their hulls, remove the 12-inch gun turrets that had defined them since the day they were designed, and rebuild them as guided missile cruisers, armed with Talos long-range anti-air missiles, Tartar point defense missiles, Regulus II cruise missiles, backed by modern sonar, and equipped to carry anti-submarine helicopters. It was, in effect, a proposal to erase almost everything that had made the Alaska class what it was, and rebuild something entirely new inside the same steel bones. The ship that had been engineered around a 12-inch naval rifle would become a ship built entirely around rockets. It never happened. The same math that doomed the Iowa-class battleships to a similar fate in this era doomed the Alaska-class conversion before it ever left the planning stage. The cost of the rebuild approached the cost of building an entirely new ship from scratch, and by the late 1950s, the Navy had newer, purpose-built missile cruiser designs, already moving through development that didn't require gutting a 15-year-old hull to get there. The conversion study was shelved. Alaska and Guam would get no second act, no rocket-age reinvention. The ships that had missed their intended war in 1945 had now missed their chance at a second life in 1958 as well. What followed was almost anticlimactic, given everything that had come before. On June 1, 1960, both ships were formally stricken from the Naval Vessel Register, the bureaucratic step that ends a ship's official existence as part of the fleet. A year later, they were sold for scrap. Alaska went to the Lipset division of Luria Brothers in New York City. Guam went to Boston Metals Company in Baltimore, sold on May 24, 1961. Within months, the steel that had once been engineered to outrun a battleship and outgun a cruiser was being cut apart and melted down, ending up as raw material for products that had nothing to do with naval warfare at all. There would be no museum ship, no Alaska-class hull preserved anywhere in the world today, unlike the Iowa-class battleships, several of which survive as floating museums that visitors can walk through. Nothing from this program remains intact. What does survive are photographs, ship's records, a handful of technical drawings, and the memory of a design concept that, for a brief and strange window in naval history, seemed like exactly the right answer to a threat that turned out to be almost entirely imaginary. So what is the honest verdict on the Alaska class, looking back with everything now known that nobody knew in 1938? The engineering itself was sound. These were not poorly designed ships. Given the specifications the Navy handed its architects, a fast, heavily armed hybrid capable of outrunning a battleship and outgunning a cruiser, the final product delivered on almost exactly what had been asked for. The guns worked. The speed was real. The ships performed their reassigned wartime role, anti-aircraft escort for the fast carriers, competently and without major incident, right through some of the most dangerous months of the entire Pacific War. What followed wasn't the ship. What failed was the premise underneath it. the intelligence assessment from the late 1930s that concluded Japan was building a supercruiser dangerous enough to justify 6 new American warships built around a single 12-inch gun duel that would decide the balance of naval power. That threat was real enough on paper to justify the program, and thin enough in reality that the ships built to counter it never once encountered what they'd been designed to fight. Historians today still debate exactly where to file the Alaska class. Some call them large cruisers, honoring the Navy's own official classification. Others insist they were battlecruisers in every meaningful sense. Ships that filled a category the U.S. Navy had never before attempted to build at this scale. The debate itself says something important. An entire class of warship existing in the gap between definitions, exactly as it had existed in the gap between the enemy. It was built to fight and the war it actually fought instead. Design B-65 was a ship that was never built. Alaska was a ship that was never needed. Between those two facts sits the entire history of the cruiser killer program. 6 warships ordered to answer a threat that existed mostly in a folder of uncertain intelligence reports. Built by a Navy that had no choice but to prepare for the worst version of an enemy it couldn't actually see. That is the real philosophy standing at the center of this story, and it cuts in 2 directions at once. One side is the philosophy of Design B-65, a weapon so threatening in rumor that a rival superpower reorganized its shipbuilding priorities around the mere possibility of its existence, without ever needing to leave the drafting table. The other side is the philosophy of Alaska, a weapon built with total engineering competence, perfectly capable of doing exactly what it was designed to do, that arrived at its own war 3 years too late to matter. A phantom rival that shaped history without ever being built. A real warship that fought a real war and still missed its mission. Both of them, in their own way, proved the same uncomfortable truth about naval power in the 20th century. Sometimes the most expensive weapons in a nation's arsenal are built not to fight the enemy that's actually there, but to answer the enemy that fear says might be. 6 ships were ordered to hunt something that didn't exist. 2 were finished. 1 sat almost complete and was simply abandoned. 3 were never more than a name and a contract number. And the ship they were all built to kill never fired a single shot, because it was never anything more than a rumor to begin with.